Dee, 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 dee. Dee, 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 dee. Dee, dee, dee.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Carla Thomas, and today I'm going to be talking about empathy, whether or not it's the link as we try to mitigate bias inside of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So just to give you a little context, I am the founder of the Realize Leadership Group. We are a consultancy that focuses on diversity and inclusion work, thinking through all aspects of organizational behavior. I'm also not just a practitioner, but I'm a scholar in the space. And so a lot of what we'll be exploring here today has to do with my own interests personally and professionally and academically. I am a business owner. I am a scholar. I am a professional, but I'm also a mother. And I happen to have a young son who is the beneficiary of two parents who are over 6 feet. And so as an African-American child in America who already looks older than his age, I'm very mindful that this work applies not only in a workplace setting, but certainly in any organization or any group of people that we find ourselves in. So it's driven my quest to find out how can we do this work better. And I want to share some of that insight, some of that information with you. So I'll be covering a few things over the next roughly 75 minutes. First, I want to talk about where we are today. Obviously, over the last 18 months especially, there's been a real emphasis placed on this type of discussion. But let's talk about where we are now and why this is a really pivotal moment in time around diversity and inclusion as a whole. We'll talk about who's in the room, who's not, what their interests are, what their concerns are, and what will drive a larger cultural transformation. And then I want to explore some of the evolution. We started out talking about appreciating cultural differences, and in some ways we brought in language like diversity and inclusion, which was new over the course of the last 30 years. But now we're making a shift to DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I want to share what has led to this journey. I want to talk about what's working, what's not working, and why. And then I want to leave you with some tools. So as I mentioned, a lot of this is built around my own research, my own observations as a practitioner in this space. I want to talk about the power of empathy, how it can change misconceptions, and how it does need to move beyond training. In the course of the next few minutes, I'm going to ask you to also take a moment to respond with any questions, comments that you have in the chat feature. It's important for us to engage in a dialogue around these issues. And so please don't hesitate to submit your questions, submit your comments. We want to convene a space that is equitable, of course. So let's talk about what's going on now. As you've likely heard, there have been a recent US census reports that have shared that we are becoming more diverse as a nation. And while that is something that as a target we've been looking at over the last, I'd say close to 50 years, we sort of saw this coming. It's all starting to move to a head. And so let's talk about what's in the room, who's in the room, what's impacting them, and what's going to drive us forward. Now, it has been explored time and time again, especially as a result of the pandemic, that there is a labor shortage. It's referred to as a labor shortage. And to a certain extent, that is the case. But there's also a talent shift that's happening. And so when we think about the crisis that's impacting where we are today, why many organizations are struggling to find their talent, are struggling to retain their talent, I believe in June of 2021, upwards of 40% of the population indicated that they were looking to find a new job. And so what does that mean for employers? What does that mean for us as a larger society? The ability to work from home in higher skilled occupations, the ability to be flexible in terms of being ready to respond to access to internet, childcare when needed, recognizing that there are certain inequalities and inequities inside of all of this is something that is very relevant when we think about our talent, when we think about our recruiting efforts, when we think about who is in the room. The pandemic really did blow up this concept that we can separate our work life and our private life. We were invited into people's living rooms. We were invited into their bedrooms. We were invited to see their families, their animals, the day-to-day lives that usually we put aside when we go into a workplace setting. And that shows up from an inequity standpoint. That shows up in how we engage with each other. At the same time that we've moved to this really rapid response to working from home, there is the issue of the working conditions for those individuals. And so we want to bear that in mind. People are carrying that into the spaces. When we're having these conversations around equity, it applies to them directly, and we want to explore that more fully. On another stage, there's pay equity. So who demands more and who ends up getting it ultimately? We have over time seen this conversation play out in politics, but it also is where politics meets policy and then ultimately meets practice. While some argue that the sustained unemployment benefits that support and have kept entire segments of the population afloat is the consequence of encouraging workers not to go back into the industry, I think it's important to call attention that the pandemic didn't just provide an opportunity for change, it imploded past norms regarding how labor is compensated, regarding how we incentivize individuals to come back into the workplace setting. The slide that you see in front of you is pulled from the June 2021 Employment Cost Index, and it shows that compensation costs for state and local government workers increased 2% over a 12-month period. Now compare that to a 2.7% increase in June of 2020. Wages are increasing, and yet they are still stagnant among certain members of the population. There are those who have decided that now is the time to make a shift into a new environment or a new opportunity or a new role. They are becoming equipped with the credentials that they need in order to be successful. And yet and still we see a lag. We see a lack of representation of certain members of our community. And so, as has been highlighted in the past, we are reaching an inflection point. We are becoming majority minority. We are reaching a place in which the makeup of the individuals who are going into the workplace are people of color. They're people of marginalized communities. In fact, not only are they coming into the workplace, but they're coming into the workplace more equipped. And so how are organizations responding to that? These are the individuals who are in the room. A year into this pandemic, 68% of American workers said having the ability to work remotely and at the work site is the ideal workplace model. We see companies left and right who are trying to figure out how do we create a hybrid environment in which people feel engaged, feel a sense of community, are not dealing with Zoom fatigue. And yet, 1 in 3 workers would not want to work for an employer that required them to be on site full time. But 2 in 3 believe in-person interactions are important for advancing their careers. Now, I mention this not just because it is sort of the battle of past norms to new norms, but also it highlights a really interesting point where bias comes up. And so why is there a need to be in person in order to engage with your colleagues, especially if there are so many technological advances that make it a superior way to accomplish work? Why is that what's required in order for individuals to advance their careers? I go into the next several slides and talking through not only the norms, what is in place today, but where there's possible bias in far as decision making and an opportunity for individuals that are a part of the conversation. Now, these are just a few of the sources that I pulled from, and if you're interested in more information about it, you can certainly look at additional resources that I'll be sharing at the end of this session. But let me also point out, this is not unique to any one industry. The things that we're seeing as far as labor shortage, as far as inequity, as far as who is being impacted by this pandemic and the resulting effect that it has on our workforce population and the culture that we create is across the spectrum, from food services to education, to social and healthcare, to real estate and construction. There is a need to change, and we have not necessarily been making the sort of headway that we would like to see. Now, I say this, and I'm a member of the practice, that we can do better. We must do better. Any gains that we might have made over the last 30 years, particularly on the front of pay equity and gender representation, we've seen slide back. Unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic and discretionary effort towards who is doing work, when, and how they're being compensated for it. But the reality is it's a confluence of events. And so as we explore this more fully, I want to pay attention to not just what's happening on a gender front, but also what's happening on a race and ethnicity front. We are seeing the highest volumes of unemployment rates that's disproportionately impacting certain members of our community. We are seeing, even as we say that we have a shortage of labor, those individuals who would like to go in the workplace are being limited in the opportunities that they can take on. So how do we address that? How do we combat it? And how do we create a space in which everyone feels seen? I do want to mention, because I think it's important as well, I think about diversity, equity, inclusion work holistically. I think about it in the context of not only the individuals who are members of an organization, but the outside forces, the societal forces that are impacting them, and how they bring that into the space. They are not separate. And so even as we're exploring who's in the room, I make a point to mention this again and again. We need to understand the stories that they're carrying, the perspectives that they hold, the conflict that has emerged across the country and across the globe, and how people are wrestling with these new ideas, how they're making sense of their own place in the world, what sort of advocacy and allyship they want to represent, where they feel attacked, where they feel marginalized in new and different ways. We're having a more targeted conversation, and we need to push that further. So as we get into the sort of the evolution of DE&I and how it's shifted to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, I want to make a point to mention, even as we've evolved, there's still more work to be done. So not only do we need to think about why these issues are happening, but we also need to think about how we came to be here. Even as we are exploring the very near future, where majority minority will be the case in the next 15 years, there is even more striking evidence that even if you are qualified, you're not necessarily going to be promoted to that next opportunity. You're not going to be able to advance in your career, which in turn impacts your ability to provide for your families in order to, exist as a part of this society. And so thinking about the evolution from DEI to DEIB, what's working? If I'm being candid, over the course of my research and what I've been able to explore, we don't know what's working. We have tried and tried again to do certain things, and yet we have not been able to demonstrate that they have an impact. We have not moved the needle not nearly far enough. And so when we think about what's working, what's not working, I'm going to lay out a full gamut of what's been done. Maybe it's something that you've experienced inside of your own environment. Maybe it's something you might want to introduce. But I also want to talk through, how do you measure success? In its totality, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a complicated journey. It is a lifelong process for any organization or any individual. That's absolutely the case. But there are certain things that we've gone to as our tried and true sort of efforts to address DEI have emerged in the last, I would say, close to 50 years. There's honestly the reality that it's not working, and here's how we know. If you're familiar, if you've ever heard of the term covering, it's an acknowledgement that each of us has to hide a piece of ourselves in order to be successful in the workplace, in order to be successful in our professions. And this is not unique to any one group of individuals. As you can see, not only among the LGBTQ+ community, where 83% of individuals cover, but also African Americans, women of color, women in general, Hispanics, and including straight white men. We all feel a need to cover in order to be able to provide for our families, to have housing, to have a good education. We feel that we need to hide pieces of ourselves just to survive. I think that needs to shift. And I think that's why belonging has been introduced as a concept, and it's something that we need to delve in deeper. Belonging is the opposite of a cancel culture. For those of you who don't know, cancel culture is a pervasive experience where if you don't like what you hear, or if it runs counter to your already existing beliefs, then you are entitled to ignore it entirely, refuse the facts, refuse to feel or engage in the concepts differently. And we'll talk about the dangers of that phenomenon. But to go further, belonging requires that we accept and appreciate that our unique perspectives are accepted, maybe not embraced, maybe not agreed with, but at least accepted. It is not to ignore difference for the sake of a culture fit, but it's a fundamental and consistent goal of normalizing how we discuss and engage with one another in our differences. and our unique challenges in order for us to continue to thrive. Covering, it means downplaying certain aspects of our identity. It means a widespread and consistent act of dehumanizing ourselves when it comes to the workplace environment. And ultimately, whether it be appearance-based or advocacy-based or affiliation-based, 93% of individuals in some way, shape, or form feel as though they need to hide pieces of themselves in order to sustain a living in a workplace environment that is unacceptable. Not only because it affects our productivity, but it affects our ability to engage with our colleagues. It affects our ability to be happy in the workplace setting, which is something that is driving talent today. The concept of a work-life balance means when I go into a workplace setting, how much of myself do I need to put in a box in order for me to be considered competent? How much of myself do I have to shut down? How many times in a meeting do I have to keep my mouth shut for fear of being considered argumentative? How many times do I have to wear my hair a certain way or dress a certain way in order to align with the culture fit? How many times do I have to sacrifice my resources in order to get a seat at the table, or as I like to refer to it, a seat at the golf course? These are things that have a detrimental effect on us in the long term, and the pandemic has opened our eyes to the ways in which across the board, individuals are questioning whether or not that should be the case. And they're raising interesting comments, and they're demonstrating their desire for something unique just by saying, I'm going to see what else is out there. So we'll talk about much of how this has affected us in the long term, but more immediately, one of the things that we've typically or historically introduced is what's known as an employee resource group. The plan here is that it's supposed to provide opportunities for employees to be heard, valued, and engaged with. What has ultimately happened, though, is that employee resource groups tend to have limited access to power. They become a venting space in which individuals get to talk about, here are the problems that I'm facing, but there's no real recourse, there's no real resource allocation, there's no attention paid to doing something about it. Employee resource groups historically have been event meeting spaces where individuals can come and learn about how to lean in, or they can learn about how to negotiate their salaries. But this is fairly limited, and it doesn't necessarily speak to the unique concerns of individuals. There's not a one size fits all that says, okay, if you speak up in a meeting, you will be received as a leader. That certainly doesn't apply to certain members of the BIPOC community, and it certainly doesn't apply to individuals who identify as female. And yet we find these being the topics for employee resource groups time after time after time. And while it can be a useful mechanism, it's certainly a tool in the toolkit, recognizing that there are some things that need to be in place in order for an employee resource group to drive empathy and to challenge norms to allow for change. Let me also mention what has definitely been the topic du jour when it comes to this DEI work, which is diversity training. And at its core, it's meant to facilitate positive intergroup interactions in the hope of reducing prejudice and discrimination. That is the goal. Historically, though, what we've seen is that learning and development practitioners, diversity practitioners, and business leaders alike struggle to define what is the return on investment for doing this sort of training. How is it moving beyond an awareness building into something tangible and behaviorally different than what has been the case before? The assumption has always been, if we create more awareness around it, then we've done our due diligence, we can check the box, and people are aware and cognizant of how they need to treat one another. But at its core, one of the things that is missing from historical diversity trainings is, one, a demonstrated result. What are we seeing differently in terms of how people experience a sense of belonging in their organizations? What are we seeing differently in terms of the behaviors that leaders exhibit, that coworkers exhibit when it comes to allyship? How are they centering themselves in the conversation? Now, on any number of different fronts, you could articulate that depending on the nature of the training, it can be really, really impactful. But how do we know? How do we measure it? My research really did identify what are those components that address bias and bias behavior, and some of the things that we can create experientially to allow folks to truly mitigate the negative effects of their biases. We'll talk about what that looks like shortly. What I also say too is from a diversity training standpoint, a training does not fix everything. In fact, it is just the tip of the iceberg. It provides and equips individuals with tools that they might need in subsequent behavior changes, but we also need to meet them where they are. We need to meet them where they are in the conversation, where they are in the conflict, and how they evaluate themselves more critically to be a part of the change. What we found and what has continued to be the case is that most individuals feel like these biased events, these actions are happening somewhere else. They're happening as a result of someone else. Most individuals don't necessarily see themselves as part of the issue. And so how do we confront that? How do we invite space for a conversation for people to not respond defensively, but to hear one another and see one another more humanely? That's building in empathy, and that addresses things like bias. Now, the power of empathy has been talked about anecdotally for a very long time. It gets raised quite frequently. And as a practitioner, and certainly as a scholar, I was curious to know what effect that empathy does have on this work that we do in the D&I space. I wanted to know if it has any bearing on biased behavior, biased thinking, and in some ways it absolutely does. But it also means recognizing and exploring some deep-seated trends that need evaluating. And so I love this particular quote. It's one of several done by Keith Kent. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. I bring that into the conversation because ultimately, you have to think about, as a leader in this space and as an individual who might be tasked with driving these changes, how do you keep committed? What is going to drive the success? What is going to drive the learnings? And ultimately, there will be some backlash, but are you prepared for that? How do you rank that on the list or the scale of what needs to get done, when, and why? I mention all of this usually at the outset of a conversation with a client ahead of doing any sort of culture assignment or culture assessment or climate study, because at its forefront, any organization needs to pay attention to where are we today, to look honestly in the mirror, and then be prepared to have a reaction based on that reflection. Be prepared that members of your organizations will likely have a reaction based on that reflection, but to look honestly at what is in place today. What are the wins? What are the areas where we can do something different? And understanding that it is not as simple as just saying we're going to do a diversity training or we're going to introduce an employee resource group. Organizational climate assessments need to be done better because they need to start assessing those things that have a behavioral impact. They need to start looking at things like organizational fairness, the perception of management's policies and procedures, specifically affecting minorities and women. They need to look more closely at things like whether or not discriminatory or preferential treatment exists in hiring and promotion. What are the mechanisms to combat it? If we're not willing to look closely, if we're not willing to ask those questions, how do we grow? How do we evolve? I'll say most climate studies don't include a component of thinking about organizational inclusion. And so this speaks to things like the actual resources that are made available. What is dedicated to inclusive practice? Do we talk about it one day and then go back to the status quo the next? Looking at that critically and getting a sense of not only across the organization, but with unique communities, whether they be certain levels of leadership, from executive on down to individual contributor, whether it be looking at this in terms of where certain individuals may sit in the organization from a departmental standpoint. But we need to be self-aware about whether or not inclusive practice exists, and if not, be able to pinpoint where some of the breakdown may be. I think it's also important for us to pay attention to different groups and who has access to power. So when we think about decision making, when we think about who is able to influence the discussion, who speaks up in a meeting and who does not, who speaks up and gets listened to and who does not, that's a mechanism that we need to tap into, that we need to have a better understanding of, and we need to do better as an organization as a whole We have to be willing to look honestly at those things. We need to think about work group involvement, personal comfort level. Are folks ready to have this type of conversation? And then if not, how do we get them ready? Are they uncomfortable with the nature of some of the dialogue? And if so, let's understand those concerns and try to address them in real time. Now, I'll say this because it's usually assumed that there's a positive intent. And while for the most part that is the case, one thing that tends to be missing from most climate assessments around building self-awareness of how the organization functions today is recognizing that individuals have their own diversity value. In fact, individuals may have a personal view of whether or not diversity is important, how relevant it is to their day-to-day jobs. And as we explore this a little bit more fully, how we act upon what we see in a climate assessment, it's important to know that not only do you need to ask folks these hard questions, you need to be prepared to tell folks what you've heard and tell individuals what you intend to do about it. All of which involves a deeper level of communication and transparency and trust building than has historically been the case. So I have said quite a bit here so far, and I'm certainly going to continue, but I want to invite folks to submit their questions, their comments in the chat feature. And as we go into this next piece about how do we confront what happens inside of the training room and how do we move it outside of a lesson, I want to highlight that there tends to be this divisiveness around an us versus them, and challenging the misconceptions around or the assumptions that we make or the walls that we built around communication between one department and the next, between one group of individuals and the next, between one leadership group and the next is critical. And that requires that we confront certain personal truths. And so I don't think it's possible to have any serious diversity and inclusion training, even if we're talking about things like unconscious bias and allyship. I don't think it's possible to have those type of sessions and have them be successful unless individuals are presented an opportunity to examine their personal beliefs. Not just with the context that, yes, I'm right and this is why I'm right, but also paying attention to things like, why am I uncomfortable when they say this? Why is my reaction anger when I hear this? How do I embody, how do I embrace this whole concept of us, meaning my team, my department, my book of business, and then the other individuals that are part of the organization that help it to succeed. We need to break down some of those silos. And it does take more than just an initial conversation in a room, but it does start with, how can I see my colleagues, my coworkers, my supervisors more openly, more honestly? What do they think about these topics that have typically been taboo to explore in a workplace setting? And how do we get comfortable engaging in some difficult conversations? What also is at the forefront of culture transformation and recognizing that this is the early outset of what it means to create a space of belonging is paying attention to aspects of empathy. Now, my research has talked about empathy, not just in the sense that it is a cognitive or intellectual awareness of someone else's experience. It requires an emotional reaction to what we encounter. It requires confronting how those emotional reactions affect us. And so there are two major components that I would encourage any diversity, equity, inclusion program to not only introduce through experiences, but also measure if there's been a change. These are not done lightly. It has been through the course of much research, much debate, that these two facets of empathy are directly related to biased behavior. If we can move the needle on negative social empathy and interpersonal empathy, we can begin to mitigate some of the negative effects of behavior that we see in other places in the workplace setting. And so let me talk about what negative social empathy is. Truly, it can be easy to say, I understand where someone's coming from. What can be most difficult, or what is actually very challenging, is demonstrating an affective response. That means sharing the emotional experience, thinking about it, and understanding the mental state of someone, especially if they are racially, ethnically, culturally different from ourselves. That can be challenging. That requires time, that requires practice. These things that we're addressing, while we're talking about them sort of anecdotally, I do want to provide some specific examples. Now, is it challenging for me to truly be able to look, for example, or hear a story of someone who's experiencing bullying and decide that, oh, well, they just need to be stronger. I was stronger. I was able to handle it. Everyone gets bullied, as opposed to sitting with the discomfort that this is actually very challenging for these individuals. If this is something that causes significant harm to them in the long term. Let me translate this into the workplace setting. We talk about microaggressions. We talk about micro inequities. We talk about the macro too. But what has typically been talked about is that these things are just individuals being too sensitive. Individuals not necessarily paying attention to the norms of the organization. They need to just get a tougher skin. We should be able to laugh more and joke more inside of the workplace environment. People should not be taking things too seriously. Now, as we tend to undermine the experiences of those around us and how we're describing and how we make equivalencies, false equivalencies for how they're showing up in the workplace, it's important to know that research has shown that microaggressions are significantly impairing, not only to productivity, but individual health and well-being. Individuals who experience microaggressions on a frequent basis are shown to have higher incidences of depression, of anxiety, of drug use, of alcohol use, absenteeism in the workplace setting. It has a tangible effect. You've likely heard before that it's this death by 1,000 paper cuts. I think that does describe it to a certain extent, a bit graphic, but I would say it's a little bit further than that. Imagine walking into a space and constantly be reminded that you are othered, constantly being reminded that you are less than, and that in order for you to succeed, you need to conform to things that do not align with your values, do not align with you as an individual. And if you don't do those things, you are not going to advance in your organization. You're not going to be able to provide for your family. And so it is a matter of life and death. In fact, there's a higher level of suicide rates that is increasing at younger ages because of things like microaggressions. So how are we talking about these concepts in a training session? Are we making them succinct? Are we talking about them abstractly? Are we allowing folks to experience those times in which they themselves have been made to feel othered? Are we allowing folks to really relate to one another and to speak honestly about the impact that these experiences have on individuals in their day-to-day lives? I'll also mention this interpersonal empathy piece. So this is the ability to sense and respond to the social pain or experiences of another whose race or ethnicity or gender differs from our own. Now, being able to recognize that someone may be experiencing something may seem like it's sort of an obvious thing to do. When we talk about allyship in the workplace and being an active bystander, we tend to assume that individuals across the spectrum are just sort of aware of what others are experiencing. And yet, let me point back to who's in the room. We are having more and more siloed conversations. We are having less nuanced discussions. We are playing out our challenges on social media campaigns, and then we just change the channel. We are reinforcing and confirming our biases by not engaging with one another across our differences. And so if we have not created a space inside of the workplace setting where individuals are present for 50, 60, 70% of their time, and we are not equipping individuals with the skills that they need in order to create a true culture of belonging. I mentioned that there are certainly different ways you can approach this, but what I'll also say too is because these things have been able to demonstrate an impact on our biased behavior, we can absolutely create a way to measure the impact of the trainings that we're having. We can absolutely create models that assess this over time. It's one of the things that transforms what we see in academia and what is emerging as far as our knowledge growth into action. When it comes to affinity groups or employee resource groups, we need to shift from just creating spaces in which people get seen, which is absolutely important, to giving and creating access to power, to influence in decision-making, and ensure that these affinity groups have authority. This does not happen without executive support. which is one of the reasons why I would argue that a shift towards DEIB means ensuring that executives are committed to and aligned to the strategies that lead to success. One of those being sponsorship for affinity groups, sponsorships for mentorship programs. They need to be a part of the process rather than dictating down everyone else needs to change. It does not get to be held solely by HR. This is work for all of us. When it comes to access to power, are individuals who are underrepresented at certain leadership levels, do they get to have exposure to certain leadership levels? Are they getting to have conversations and present their body of work? Are they getting access to opportunities that stretch their skill sets and give them more exposure? Are they able to add their voice to the conversation when they feel like something is done inappropriately or ineffectively? And how are they treated as a result? Now, this speaks to, in many cases, a lack of trust. Affinity groups exist as a means for folks to engage in the conversation that they would not otherwise be privy to, or to engage in a conversation about how they can support one another as members of an organization. And so if we're not tying it to direct authority, direct access to power, direct influence, then we've missed the mark. This is another area that becomes more and more prevalent as we think about talent and where talent is headed in the years to come. There is a term that you might be familiar with called corporate social responsibility. It aligns to the idea that members of an organization or leaders of an organization have a responsibility to affect the communities that they are involved in, the communities that their brick and mortar locations happen to represent. They have a responsibility to those outside of their internal shareholders and their employees. Now, it is without question something that plays a direct part in how we tend to operate inside of organizations, that we need to think about, are we integrating social and environmental concerns? Is it a part of our business operations? Is it an aside? Now, this particular image not only highlights some of the societal experiences that are currently in our just ethos, but it also speaks to the responsibility or belief that an organization or a workplace setting has the ability to address these needs. And so you could point to any number of different environments, whether it be Silicon Valley and the cost of living and how that is sort of priced individuals out of being able to afford homes in the area, to thinking through how do you create spaces in a place like Hawaii for the individuals that are native to that community to be able to exist and afford to live inside of that environment. You could talk about the increase in technology and how that affects the workplace population, and how are we preparing and creating talent pipelines for that workplace population to be able to take advantage of these new innovations. But across the spectrum, if it is not a part of the larger business operations imperative, then we've missed the mark. This also takes a shift from what has always been a discussion about, oh, I appreciate your differences, I see you, and that's awesome and great for you, to how do we be more inclusive and tangibly inclusive and equitable at that. Now, there are any number of reasons why these efforts tend to succeed, tend to fail, but I think at its core, and what is most critical, is the idea that accountability is the glue that ties commitment to results. Most often, when I hear of organizations that have tried to take on some form of DE&I initiative or DEIB initiative, what has been missing or what is lacking is that they throw out all these new activities. They create book groups and they create like resource areas and they create campaigns as far as communication. But what they don't weave into is the accountability piece. And so what happens? Is there a course of action that is laid out for when an incident occurs? Is there an expectation that leaders take part in these efforts? And if so, how are they demonstrable in making sure that there's a difference? What I'm going to lay out here next is one of the ways you can pay attention to this throughout the course of an entire employee life cycle experience, but it does start with accountability. So accountability is one of the biggest areas of focus that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. When I think about all the different places where you can see that message from individual organizations, individual leaders saying, we believe in the importance of diversity. We believe in being an equal opportunity employer. And then you don't necessarily see that translated into action. That is something that employees notice, they respond to. The apathy around these subjects is something that we are much more inclined to pay attention to now. And so let's talk about accountability. Let's talk about how it can be woven into the process and how to ensure that we are measuring for success. Accountability means not talking very broadly about what it means to create a diverse organization or what it means to create an equitable organization. It means talking about it very specifically, tying it to KPIs, tying it to OKRs. It means talking about it in terms of how do we revision our job descriptions. If you do not have a line in your job description stating that the responsibility of every employee is to ensure a space in which they create a sense of belonging, then you're missing the mark. If you do not give them specific action items about how they can go about doing so, then you're missing the mark. I'll say that's even more critical when you look at a leadership role. If the manager is not expected to have certain types of conversations with their employees on a frequent basis, that includes understanding and having a sense of what the employee needs may be, having a sense of how they can support them further, then you are missing the mark. I'll say too, when it comes to accountability, the biggest way in which we drive accountability is through our performance evaluation, our performance management conversations, which in turn impact our compensation. Now, historically, these performance management discussions, you see a lot of debate about, well, we shouldn't just have them annually, we should have them more frequently. There should be feedback loops for individuals to share feedback with their direct reports. But what gets missed there and what's pretty glaring is that this is a top-down communication. Very rarely is it a bottom-up opportunity to provide feedback. And so I would encourage a level of accountability that ensures some skip level conversation. So you're not just having to speak to your direct supervisor, but you can go above them and share certain concerns that you may have. I would also say that from an accountability standpoint, there's an easy thing that you can do and just creating a list of questions and a protocol for managers to have certain discussions with their team members. You should also, and I invite every leader to do this, create a space in which these are not just one-on-one conversations, but it's a group dialogue. And so, especially with folks coming back into the workplace setting in some way, shape, or form, it's a great time for leaders to create accountability around what are our group norms? How are we engaging with each other? What's our standard operating procedure for how regularly folks need to be sharing their screen for Zoom meetings or go-to meetings? What's our standard operating procedure for being mindful of folks' time? And so we're not sending out emails at 3 o'clock in the morning and expecting a response right away. How are we ensuring that folks feel seen in meeting conversations? Even as basic as, how do we decide how to decide? If there is a decision-making meeting that occurs, no matter what the leadership level, are you creating opportunities for folks to add their voice, to disagree, to find some level of collaboration and consensus? Or are we dictating down via strong hierarchy that no, I'm the boss? This looks like, in most cases, having a meeting in which you're talking about a particular topic and everyone doesn't stop and pause and look to the leader to say what's next. It's actually inviting anyone that's a part of that table to be a part of the authority and sharing that resource allocation of discussion and decision. I'll also say too, from an accountability standpoint, it is important that there be some demonstrable results. And so you'll see in many organizations, there is not an emphasis placed on, these are the expectations that we have in terms of the leaders creating a sense of belonging or inclusion or equitable practices. This looks like, for example, if you are in a decision-making role and you are responsible for hiring a new team member, what is your rationale behind passing on candidates A, B, C? There should be some documentation around that. If that doesn't exist, that's a problem. That's an area where bias can show up. What is the opportunity for others besides you as the hiring manager to be involved in the decisions around who can join the team. This is a moment too where you do need to have other perspectives. There's a lens through which you view this that others may view differently. And so inviting that dialogue, inviting that opportunity for folks to provide their input really is a moment of accountability that in turn impacts what is the makeup of your team. What are the opportunities that you see for various members of your team to advance? How are you creating opportunities for them to do so? These are things that typically they're not woven into the job description for most managers, and certainly not higher levels of executive leadership. And in turn, this is not something that gets evaluated on a regular basis. And so most organizations wouldn't know how to compensate a leader who is doing above and beyond when it comes to diversity and inclusion work, or is doing the bare minimum. But we need to start assessing these more closely. We need to pay better attention to the KPIs that we create, and in turn, the ways in which we celebrate our successes. So that can't just be a quick highlight in the column of you got an increased promotion. How are we socializing these messages? How are we ensuring that other people have individual resources across the organization that they can go to and say, wow, thank you for what you're doing. Can you tell me more about the type of equity that you're creating within your own team? How are we creating those models for success? So accountability, it continues to be the area I think where the most improvement is needed. We create some large, far-reaching goals, and we say, here's our 5-minute plan for success for our organization, and diversity is a big part of this, but we don't talk about it concretely. We don't look at it closely. And one of the ways we can do so is by starting with that climate assessment that I mentioned, that is evaluating things that we have a behavioral impact on, that we can actually address, that we can course correct. I'll say the same too for the training programs that we create. While empathy is definitely anecdotally something that's talked about, and up until recently and up until my my work, there was no real demonstration between empathy and bias. What we know now is that not only is empathy something that can address our biases in various moments, it's also something that we have agency and ability to control. So as leaders of our organizations, how are we doing our due diligence to ensure that empathy is introduced? How are we doing our due diligence to ensure that we are truly committed to different results? Fortunately or unfortunately, you'll find that the talent is pushing us there. If we want to be an employer of choice, then we have to make some changes. I'll also say, fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of the governing bodies for various organizations, like the NASDAQ, for example, are creating a higher level of expectation that organizations do more than just the status quo. And so I invite us to take a hard look at what that future can look like and how we can get there. Now, there's an integration that needs to happen between the strategy and the big picture think and the tangible daily tactical efforts that we take on. Thinking about that from the recruiting channel. Now, what are the needs of the marketplace? What are the individuals that are coming into that space? What are they seeking? This requires a certain level of empathy. We need to ask them. We need to pay attention to what their needs are. Whether it be accommodation for childcare, whether it be some sort of recourse for addressing the compensation differences that happen from one job to the next, and the inequity that exists for certain members of our community. Whether it means where we ultimately source or how we message what it is that we do. What are the needs of the marketplace? If that question has not been asked as comprehensively as it can be, now is the time to do so. The needs of the marketplace have been very clear. Talent is looking for some sort of work-life balance. They're looking for the flexibility to be able to work remotely. They're looking for spaces in which employers have demonstrated that they feel a sense of corporate responsibility, that they have a voice in the conversation about the social issues that exist today, and that they are doing something demonstrably inside of their own practices to make this a more level playing field. What you'll also see is that there is a desire for some sort of acknowledgement of the financial burdens that are being placed on various members of our community. How are we making a point to provide tuition reimbursement, for example? Is that written in from a compensation strategy? How are we considering our benefits? And how are we communicating not only our values, and the nice to haves, but the things that make us unique as an employer? Now, there is so much time and attention that gets paid to the recruitment side of diversity work. But then you have to think about what happens once individuals arrive. If there is no space for folks to have access and understanding and exposure across the organization to understand the various moving parts of it, they do not see themselves represented there via the LinkedIn pages and company websites, and having some regular communication around here's what we do because we think diversity is important. That is a pivotal part of the onboarding experience. Most individuals, most employees decide within the first 9 months whether they're going to stay inside that organization, whether it's a place for them. And they do so quite candidly within the first 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Once you get to 9 months, they have already decided whether or not they're going to opt in or bide their time. And so how are you being intentional from recruitment to transitioning the individuals to their best opportunity for success? What I'll also say too is this is the moment for empathy. Are you inviting conversations? Are you asking individuals? Are leaders having one-on-one conversations with their new reports to talk through what are your needs? What are your goals? What do you hope to accomplish here? How can I help you to succeed? What do you need in terms of communication style? How frequently should we be touching base with each other? All of these are touch points to create a sense of empathy and to build trust and to build a level of collaboration that lends itself to belonging. From a retention standpoint, what I find is that there are experiences and there's exposure that tends to happen for certain members of the population, majority groups predominantly, whether it be being invited to the golf course or the happy hour or to connect with certain senior leaders. It means that these experiences are held by a select few. These exposures are held by a select few. Now, an example of this would be if an individual does not partake in alcohol for whatever reason, are they less inclined to be successful in their job because they're not taking part in the company or the office happy hour? Historically, yes, that's been the case. But is that relevant to their ability to do their job? And so are we creating experiences that allow us to retain our talent? Are we creating experiences that allow them to advance and succeed? This goes into development pieces. Are we creating stretch assignments? Do we have a sense of what people's desires are when it comes to stretch assignments? Are we giving them access to different parts of the organization? None of this happens without regular input from individual employees. And so it should be built into performance management conversations. It should be a space where we ask the question, what are you looking for? Rather than just saying, I need you to do this. It should be a space where we are open to taking that information that we receive and creating individualized learning plans for our employees. It means also recognizing that there are going to be moments in time where we are asking individuals to demonstrate a new skill set, particularly when it comes to removing some of those coverings and the weight of it, particularly when it comes to addressing certain biases and beliefs that we are not even aware that we hold. And so how are we creating learning opportunities? How are we creating training sessions? How are we creating empathy circle experiences? How are we allowing folks to practice building a new set of skills? None of this work happens overnight. And so when we're looking across the spectrum of the strategy here, there are definitely opportunities to do specific things at various moments in time. What I'll mention is that what tends to get overlooked or what tends to be focused on at the exclusion of everything else is the separation, the attrition. We are seeing that happen across the spectrum, across a wide range of different backgrounds and diverse attributes. Individuals are deciding to leave the organization. What's interesting though, is that they're leaving for different reasons. And so while it is maybe a little bit too late, it is also a data point that can inform what happens before. So what could have been done differently? What is being done well? Are there stay interview conversations? that are taking place in your organization? Do you find out why the highest successful individuals that are doing a phenomenal job, what keeps them a part of the team? Are you taking the time to ask what more can be done to develop you personally and what keeps you loyal to this group of individuals? And what's interesting is that it tends to be their relationship to their leaders. It's not the compensation, although that's important. It really is a matter of the relationship with their leaders and their peers. And so how are we creating spaces for folks to be able to share, here's what I'm carrying into a room, before they decide to leave the organization or before it shows up on a Glassdoor or it becomes a viral incident in which someone's talking about it on TikTok. Empathy being integrated into the broader strategy of DEIB work means taking the time to look at the various components of where and how and when we touch individuals' lives and having conversations with them that can have an impact on them in the longer term. Now, there is certainly a debate about when this work needs to be started, what's driving this work today, and how do we continue it. I believe firmly that while empathy is a link, and you'll notice from my title I put is empathy it. It is a critical component, but I do think there's much more to come. I think we'll be continuing over the span of the next several years to come to really have to evaluate and course correct how are we incentivizing accountability? Are we ensuring that it's woven into job descriptions, the expectations that we have for various leaders? Are we assuring that it's tied to merit increases? Are we inserting that it's applied to basic compensation? And how much are we willing to hang on that? What I'll also say too is there's sort of an ambiguity about the target. Granted, it's a moving target at that, but what is the ultimate goal? What is the larger vision for DEIB? I think that needs to be looked at more critically. Are we trying to create a space in which individuals do not have to cover? Are we trying to create a space in which individuals don't have to cover and they don't have to fear the retributions of not doing so? This means looking more closely at all of our endeavors, all of our interactions, and being willing to look in the mirror. Now that is tough to do. It is tough to do, but I will say the interesting part of the talent that we have in place today is that they're driving forward the conversation and it's not going anywhere. There will unfortunately be subsequent incidences that drive us to a deeper level of introspection. It's just a matter of how far along the learning curve are you willing to go as an organization to be ready for it. Now, I would also suggest here is a great time if you have any questions about what's coming next or any questions about what's been shared before, I'm happy to speak to it. But one thing that I will also mention is that even as we're thinking through empathy and the different ways in which you can create empathetic encounters and allow folks to see each other more humanely, I also think it's critical for us to pay attention to power. So there's a power grab that's in place right now. There's a power differential that exists. Those that have maintained the status quo have benefited from it. And so how do you incentivize those individuals to care enough to do something different? How do you tap into the principles of altruism? How do you tap into whether it be a person's intrinsic values or their extrinsic values in order to drive a behavior change? I think that's where we need to go next in the discussion. I also think we need to do a better job of integrating what you've seen me describe here already today. There's a fantastic conversation that's happening in the academic space. Now we need to translate it into the practice. And those two groups don't tend to talk as frequently as they should. So if you are a part of a higher education institution, for example, there's a phenomenal opportunity to talk to the resources, the scholars who are pulling this stuff together now and seeing how they can put it to the benefit of the entire university or the entire college. I would say the same thing for creating communities of practice among other DE&I practitioners. We should be having a shared dialogue. We should be having a conversation about what's working and what's not working. It's not just a matter of posting for that job for a chief diversity officer. It's making sure the chief diversity officer can go to their peers and go to the industry and get a better sense of what's in place today and how can we push push this forward. Now, I mentioned these things, recognizing that there are more questions than answers. We are still uncovering what works and what doesn't and why. But I would push us, not only for myself as an individual, as a mother, as a practitioner, as a scholar, but all of us as members of a larger community. We should be doing better. We can be doing better. And so I challenge each of us to look at that more critically and to come forward with ideas. We will try some things out, and in some cases they will work, and in some instances they will not, but it's worth the effort to do our due diligence to try. We would be better off across all of our institutions and all of our organizations if we make a point to do so. So I want to thank you for your time and for your attention. As I mentioned, I am really committed to continuing to ask the hard questions and to do this work well. And I invite you to share those questions in the chat feature and amongst ourselves as we move forward towards an area of belonging and shift the conversation that much further. Thank you again for your time. My name is Carla Thomas.
We got this.